Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning and to review these things that are so incredibly important and near and dear to my heart. To give you a little background, I am Paul Putnam. I am the Managing Funeral Director of Chapel of the Resurrection Mausoleum and Funeral Home Ministry here at Cedar Park. We serve the entire community. And that's one of the beauties of what God has allowed Cedar Park to do in a lot of different ways. One of them would be several years ago, in the 90s, Pastor Joe Featon established the mausoleum ministry along with the board of Cedar Park Church. And so they built a mausoleum and there was a chapel inside. And then later on, a gentleman named Mike Sonnenberg approached Pastor Joe about having a licensed funeral home on the campus. And 24 and a half years later, here we are, a fully licensed funeral home serving the entire community. Obviously, the tendency is word of mouth, and so we have a lot of families coming from various backgrounds, and so it's an opportunity to be a blessing to those when they're going through the most difficult time of their life. And this morning, I want to just kind of do that overview of estate planning and advanced planning when it comes to funerals specifically, and there's some things that are going to overlap, but just to give you an idea, I was pastoring a church and took a break from pastoring and went into the funeral industry at a different location. And it was a temporary career. And so here I am, and I've actually been here at Cedar Park working in the funeral home ministry for over 20 years this last year. And so being a unique nonprofit, you can see the value that we have for the, go ahead, next slide there. So the question is, how are you planning for your future? And there's a lot of different ways. We wish there was just kind of a real unique one way or just turnkey thing. And usually what happens, if the more planning you get done, the more that you're able to actually make it more turnkey for those left behind. And that's the key part of all this. And so throughout this morning, as you hear us talk, I hope that you'll be encouraged to make those plans. It can seem difficult, it can seem strange even for some, and yet ultimately what a blessing it is for those left behind. The Chapel of the Resurrection Ministry, I'm going to go to the next slide. Sorry, I hope we can edit that out. So one of the things I always say is make sure that you communicate. Communicate with the people nearest and dearest with you. Communicate with your friends. When it comes to advanced directives and things like that, or even advanced planning, one of the powers of advanced planning is making sure someone is in place, some people are in place to take care of things when that time comes for you. So it doesn't just fall on a burden on just one person, but even having backup people, so to speak. And there's a lot of different things I believe will be mentioned in other parts of this, but I always like to say is, set aside information about your medical information, who your physician is, and specialist surgeries, allergies, pharmaceuticals, and if you desire organ and tissue donation, that's a huge decision that on the day, we constantly get calls asking about that, and families are put kind of in a pressure situation, not knowing what did my loved one want. And the Medicaid assistance is part of what when you go into DSHS Medicaid assistance, we help with that a lot as far as being able to shelter funds that will take care of the funeral when the time of need occurs. One of the philosophies of our ministry is very biblical. And in Acts chapter 6, verse 2, it said that godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. Sometimes there's things about biblical culture that we can see that is more implied rather than specifically called out. And this is one of the ways God specifically called us to when it comes to funerals. It's an important thing to have the elements that are going to allow for people to say goodbye. And next slide. So what happens when someone passes away? What happens when someone dies? So if they're in an accident, usually the medical examiner is involved. Okay, so usually they're going to be taking control of the decedent, maybe providing an autopsy of some type. A lot of times families will ask, well, isn't the medical examiner going to perform an autopsy? They don't always do. That's their choice and their decision. And frankly, there are private autopsy options that, cost several $1,000s, but sometimes families want that. If someone's away from home, someone might be traveling, again, that local jurisdiction would be in charge with taking the decedent in their care and then working with next of kin on next steps. If someone passes away unexpected in their home, you have to call 911. Okay? Number one, that's the very first thing to know, is that if someone is not under any medical supervision or hospice care and they pass away, you need to call 911, even if it's in the home. If someone is in home hospice care, typically when someone's being set up for hospice care, the hospice organization is going to be asking, who is the funeral home you've selected? And oftentimes that's when people even call us or call around, and they might do a bit of shopping, frankly, and find out what's the prices and all that sort of thing. We get a lot of those calls. And again, at a nursing home or medical facility, usually those facilities will even ask, who is the funeral home in case something happens, right? And so under those jurisdictions, the medical examiner and the county, usually it's facilitated by the county jurisdictions, will authorize the funeral home to come and take the decedent in their care after they've received the initial call and just verification that there's no foul play. And both in the main counties that we serve, in King and Snohomish County, the medical examiners are very involved, and they also have a very large jurisdiction. In other words, there's a huge populace in King County especially that can create for a lot of red tape, if you will, as far as making sure things are taken care of. So what does the family do next? This is where it gets very difficult for those left behind. Whether it's a sudden, unexpected death, whether it's something where someone's under hospice care and it's anticipated. Usually what happens to most people is they kind of enter into what we call a fog in their emotions, mentally. What do I do next? And so they're relying on a lot of other people to help them walk through that. So if there's not a lot of advanced planning set up, that's where there can be more and more challenges. So the first thing that typically happens is they meet with a funeral director, okay? And so that constitutes needing to select a funeral home. And so one of the things I want to point out is sometimes people have a presumption about what funeral home they should select. Usually a lot of people might look in their local area and say, well, I need to call this one because it's in the same city. Sometimes people might own burial property, like cemetery property, or even property in our mausoleum or other mausoleums in the area. Or maybe someone might say, it's a veteran in the armed forces, so we can have burial at Tahoma National Cemetery in Kent. So all those different things can come into play of the decision making. And so if it's made at the last minute, a lot of times people are presuming, like we have people that presume if they have burial property at a cemetery and that cemetery also has a funeral home on its grounds, that they need to use that funeral home. And that's not true at all. In fact, in some cases, people might even have paid prearrangements at a funeral home and presume that they need to use that funeral home, even if maybe ownership has changed hands, which has happened a lot in our region. They actually, in the funeral part of it, they can actually still select a different funeral home if they want. So those are all things that people need to know about the flexibility of their plans and advanced planning, and to minimize the assumptions that they make out of emotional distress when someone's passed away. Well, they need to call their family and friends, and a lot of times that's done even maybe before they call the funeral director. If they're awaiting a medical examiner or if they're awaiting fire and police to, help determine what's happened. And then meeting with the pastor. One of the things that we try to do is make sure that people, when they experience a loss, that they're tied back with their place of worship. In other words, even if they're not a part of Cedar Park or this church, if they don't have a church, certainly want to reach out to them and provide whether it be a pastor or one of our team to sit down with them and talk through things, what they're experiencing. But when you meet with the pastor, a lot of times it's preparing for the ceremony. And so in preparing for the ceremony, there's a lot of opportunities to exalt Christ in those ceremonies, and a lot of opportunities to see how people might, walk through the different selections that they might have. And then ultimately, there's closing out the estate. And there'll be more explaining about that as we move along throughout this day. But there's important things like the funeral home is in charge of getting the death certificates, typically the initial order for the death certificates for an estate. And so that's one of the things that the funeral home provides as a service that we do anyway, included in our packages that people select. And we do that ongoing. People have up to a year to order them through our account with the counties and avoid any additional fees. So one of the things that I will say as part of the overall vision of this ministry at Chapel of the Resurrection is the mausoleum. And it's important to know that throughout Scripture, we're called to remember. We're called to remember events of what God did. We're called to remember people. And so that may result in the desire to have a place for burial. Believe it or not, Chapel of the Resurrection Mausoleum has crypt burial, which means a full casket goes into the wall. Now, one of the things that people are unfamiliar with in a lot of ways, in our modern times especially, is that mostly around this region and even the West Coast, there's mostly ground burial for caskets. And so what's unique about the chapel is that we've done something somewhat historical in that we actually have crypts in the wall where caskets can be placed. It actually turns out to be very economical, the choice that was made by the church way back. And actually we are continuing to wanting to build up even more mausoleum space for casket burial. The other thing is that we also have niches for cremated remains. And those niches can provide a place, again, to place the cremated remains and to have an inscription on them. There's a lot of different personalization that can be done, but typically the mausoleum type of setup has a somewhat uniform look to it. And if you go out and you look around the back of the Chapel of the Resurrection, you'll see those mausoleum spaces and you'll see that uniformity. And that's what actually brings a lot of beauty to it. And yet there's plenty of ways to personalize with epitaphs, photos, and whatnot. We just completed, just a little less than a year ago, we completed another phase of our niches, and so we have quite a bit of inventory of niche space available for years to come. As we move along and build more crypts, that's the whole goal is to have a place where people can have a place to celebrate their Christian heritage, if you will, and to make those unique statements about being a Christian and the hope of heaven. It also, we try to keep it very economical in comparison to what's happening in the landscape of burial options. And there's also what we call cenotaphs. So if someone is even buried in a different cemetery or out of state, or maybe there's been other choices made with the remains. There's cenotaphs, which just simply means there's no remains placed there, but they kind of look like a niche, and it's a place where they can be memorialized. And so having a place to remember we believe is very important. Our chapel, if you've been out there, is a beautiful chapel. It's a very unique chapel in the sense as a funeral chapel. It is very focused on Christ. And we're here to exalt Jesus Christ, and with large 6 by 10 foot oil paintings of the life of Christ, and a wonderful stained glass window of Jesus coming back with the New Jerusalem, and just a very inspirational setting. And we want to encourage you, if you haven't been out there, please come and visit the chapel. It's more than just a funeral home. It is actually something that will facilitate celebrations, and that's part of what we want to encourage in every family that we serve, is that we can, yes, mourn, but mourn with hope and celebrate a life that is impacted. You know, one of the famous sayings that Pastor Joe Featon would often say, I don't know if he coined it himself personally, but he will say as he begins the service, we're not here because someone died, we're here mostly because someone lived. And that's really, the impact of that person's life is so important, and we have that opportunity to celebrate that life. So there's two choices when advanced planning. You know, in the very first experience I had in working in the industry, I worked at an area cemetery as an advanced planner and a cemeterian, if you will. It's what we called family service. It sold cemetery plots and memorial markers and stones. And one of the things I began to realize is I constantly had people coming in and said, my mom bought a plot here and everything's included. Well, then I would go into the file and see they bought a plot, but nothing else. And what was interesting is that it really added up to be about 1/10 of the overall cost. And that's the one thing that I try to emphasize with everyone considering advanced planning, is that finding a way to make sure that, number one, selections are made, and number two, that finances have been set aside to take care of those selections. I'll get into a little bit more about that in just a moment. But these are the two pieces that can be done at two different locations. So like I mentioned earlier, some people use our funeral home and have burial at a different cemetery. Some people, you know, use our mausoleum and have a funeral home at another location. I'm not sure why they would do that, but I'm kind of teasing. But in reality, that has happened very rarely. And then most of the time, if they have space at our mausoleum, they're also using our funeral home. And in that funeral plans, you have the traditional funeral. And one of the things that sometimes people think is a traditional funeral has to do with viewing, yes, but it also has to do whether there's a casket present or not. That's the difference between a funeral and a memorial service. Is usually at the funeral, the casket is present. At a memorial service, it is not. Some would view, there's a little bit of gray area there, and sometimes people want the urn at the service with the cremated remains there at the service in a nice urn displayed on a table up front. And that sometimes can be viewed as a traditional type of service, and yet in the funeral vernacular, it is not. It's a memorial service. And as you go through those different funerals and the viewing, one of the things that some people don't realize is that you can have complete traditional style of service, including viewing and everything, and then in the end, you can have cremation. And a lot of people are unaware of that. When they think cremation, they think there's no viewing, there's no funeral, you know. And that's where we want to make sure people understand those options. There are so many options, so many options. There's things like fingerprint jewelry. So a lot of times we sit down with families and we ask, do you want us to take fingerprints for a fee? Because you can actually order fingerprint jewelry of your loved one that forever has been, you know, is with you and a reminder. And it can be like an heirloom. There's cremation jewelry where you can put a portion of the cremated remains. There's jewelry that you don't have to put a portion of the cremated remains. On and on it goes. There's different types of urns. There's keepsake urns. And Seattle is even known for its glass art. So we can actually get glass figures that have a portion of the cremated remains mixed in with different colors and things like that. There's all sorts of different options. Now, this might seem very foreign to many of you, if not all of you. It is something that seems maybe even a little bit strange. But there's different ways that people remember. And that's part of the whole equation of this. And we also want to be that a place that is going to facilitate everyone that is looking for different options, even if it's something we personally may not do. So in cremation, sometimes, in fact, a lot of times, we have families that simply want us to facilitate for the cremation. And so if they're doing a service at their church or another facility and not here on our grounds, then they can just do a simple direct cremation and then handle any payment or honorarium towards, at that other location. And here at Cedar Park, because we have the funeral home, everything runs through the funeral home even when there's any type of service involved. So the burial plan, I mentioned about our mausoleum. There's different cemeteries. Anybody know the difference between a cemetery and a memorial park? Okay, I know, I'll just cut to the quick and say, a cemetery indicates that you have upright headstones. A memorial park indicates that you probably have flat headstones. In other words, nothing is above the ground and the lawnmowers can just mow all of the grass. They don't have to weed it around the edges typically. So that's technically the difference. You'll notice some cemeteries, they'll have a memorial park section, and other uprights in other areas and things like that. All the things you really thought, oh wow, I didn't know I would need to know that this morning on a Saturday. But there's also people that choose to do scattering, and there's all sorts of different ways that people do scattering. And one of the things that, just like the ferry system, for a fee, you can put remains in a biodegradable pillow that we can provide for you, and they launch it off they stop the ferry, they launch it off, and it's kind of a ceremonial thing in some of their routes. There's different ways that people might go up into the mountains, and we also counsel them as far as who they need to contact when they're doing such a thing to make sure that everything is kosher. There's some people that travel clear across the world to return the cremated remains to someone's homeland. And so you need some special paperwork for that. And so that's something that, again, as a funeral home, that we provide. And sometimes there's even things that happen in the home, and where people might just choose to have a small gathering. The biggest thing that we encourage is to have some type of gathering where people come together, tell stories, reflect on the life, and focus on the things that would draw your attention to heaven and draw your attention to eternal values and what can be left behind. So here's how funeral planning works. And out in the foyer and online at chapel.cedarpark.org, we have an advanced planning worksheet. And this advanced planning worksheet is a very powerful tool. The first thing it does is it gathers information. And in gathering that information, there's things like a social security number, where a person was born, their highest education, their predominant occupation in their lifetime. And sometimes people don't even know how to describe that. I had that happen the other day, where they're like, what would you call what they did? This question mark. And so here they're making funeral arrangements for their loved one, and they have to work through thinking through all these different, what am I supposed to put? Things like the father's name and mother's maiden name. Okay, do you know your mother's maiden name? Most people sitting here probably do. Now, do your kids or anybody who's handling your funeral arrangements know your mother's maiden name? Maybe not. It happens often. Okay, and so then research has to be done, and what was their middle name, which isn't crucial, but there's a lot of different things that sometimes those left behind will not know off the top of their head, that they're walking in to make funeral arrangements and they don't have that information. We, at no charge, will take an advanced planning worksheet, put it in our files, and it's there indefinitely until needed. You don't even have to pay a penny for that. It's a simple thing to do, and it's a very powerful tool, because on that advanced planning worksheet, you'll see a directive down below that you name a person to handle your funeral arrangements. It doesn't have to be a relative, but as long as we encourage like your signature and then 2 witnesses, and you're saying so-and-so, I want them to handle my funeral arrangements. Now what happens is sometimes, and you'll hear also that option in wills and trusts and advanced directives, power of attorneys sometimes will list a person that's to handle funeral arrangements. The key to all that is that it has to be specifically named and the actual selection of what you want. This document actually takes care of all that. It's readily available in the funeral home's file. We pull it out, and this is what the person wanted, and this is who what they call a primary authorized agent. And according to Washington state law, if someone selects, pays for, and names a person, we have to follow through on that by law. And that's the power of planning ahead. So, when you make the selections, that can be put into this actual document, and including cremation. One of the things that I note up there is that I also included water cremation, otherwise known as alkaline hydrolysis. It's a brand new process within the last few years in the state of Washington. And I believe you'll hear more about it to come, but there's the option of water cremation, more expensive currently, but you never know how that will go when anything new is introduced. So there's whether there's viewing or no viewing, you make those selections in that advanced planning worksheet, and then where the burial is going to be. All those things can be consolidated on one sheet of paper. And then you choose how the plan will be paid for. And this is very crucial because obviously not everybody can pull out their wallet and plop a credit card on the table and say, this will take care of everything. Now, if it's, maybe that's the case. And yet one of the options that we give is the ability to set aside funds. And the way that the state of Washington, most states do it, is that you either typically set aside the funds in insurance. And so we have Forethought Insurance, which is owned by a company called Global Atlantic. Forethought Insurance, I should back up and say funeral homes cannot retain money for a person's funeral arrangements prior to their death. A lot of people don't realize that. They think, I'm going to pay the funeral. Well, they did years ago. The funeral home went out of business. They lost all their money. That didn't really happen locally here, but it happened across our nation. So the Federal Trade Commission stepped in and said, funeral homes, you will not retain monies for someone's funeral arrangements prior to their death. It has to go into a third party that you can't control. And in this case, we use Forethought Insurance, since I started here 20 years ago. And so we have over $1 million of different people that have come to us and set up their funeral plans and set aside the funds in Forethought Insurance, ready for when that time of need occurs. And it can work just like clockwork, I tell you. It's night and day in so many ways when it comes to following through on the pre-arrangements that have been paid for. And that's so there's those different ways that you can do it, out of pocket or from the estate. Sometimes the estate, like people say, well, can I assign an insurance plan I already have? Yes, you can. Now, two things to consider there is that sometimes it can take 60 to 90 days for that money to come in. And so that's where we ask that someone basically fronts the money and gets reimbursed from the insurance plan, okay? There's also the aspect of getting the death certificate finalized and all that to send to the insurance company. That's one of the things that it can be delayed. I'm glad we're going to edit this, right? Because now my brain just went, oop. So in all of that, you have the options to make sure that it's paid ahead of time and make sure that it's very turnkey when someone walks through the door as far as your next of kin. On the next slide, there's also travel plans. So if people do a lot of traveling, we actually have solutions for that as well. And you'd be surprised, it's not incredibly expensive, a little over $400 per person, depending on if it's for one person or two people. But anywhere in the world, we're partnered with a company that actually provides a lot of our shipping of decedents around the world. We've shipped caskets to Indonesia, to Romania, to Russia, to Africa, all over, and we ourselves have coordinated that. And one of the things that happens is when people do travel a lot, there's a lot of times in travel plans, they can have some of this type of a resource that you can purchase with a travel itinerary. And we have it where it's purchased and it's indefinite for the rest of your life, no matter what trip you go on, no matter where in the world. And what happens is it guarantees that the decedent would be transported to the nearest location that would provide what their prearrangements reflect. And there's more information about that we'll have out, that is available if you reach out to us. So ultimately, regarding insurance, and we oftentimes plan for things that might happen. Like, anybody here not have home insurance that owns their home? Well, I hope you have it. I think the mortgage company says you have to have it, right? And so, or maybe medical emergencies, Hopefully we all have health insurance, at least major medical insurance, if there's a catastrophic type of situation. Or auto accidents. You have to have auto insurance, just so you know. I hope you all have that, right? So we plan for things that might happen, and the reality is, Unless Jesus comes back before you die, you're going to need funeral arrangements, okay? And that's going to happen. You may not get in an accident in your car. You may not have a claim on your house. You may not have a medical emergency in your lifetime, and yet the thing that to really look at is how are things set up for those left behind. And so here's part of the whole kicker. And all of these things we're talking today, this is the way you say I love you, like planning the end of life events. And in all the different things we try to do, it's so important that we have, and I've literally had people sit at the table with me where someone had to have everything planned out and said, what a gift. I feel so loved. I've literally had people say, I feel so loved. And that warms my heart, because standing to you today, this is where I'm passionate about people planning ahead. It's so vital. The next slide will give you kind of it's not so much reading this list, but it's knowing these are the things that have to be done when someone passes away, when someone dies. And it's really hard to read. I guess you could read a little bit if you got good distance sight. But the reality is some of these things might apply, some of them may not, but ultimately there are just a plethora of things that need to be done when it comes to when you're planning someone's funeral and dealing with the estate left behind. And there's actually scriptural backing to everything I'm talking about today. In 2 Corinthians 12:14, it says, after all, children should not have to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. It's a biblical thing to leave an inheritance. And, one of the issues we have today is in medical care and the cost of that and how it's depleted, some estates. And that's where we get in kind of going back to that DSHS Medicaid assistance that happens. I get calls all the time. Can we set aside money for my loved one's funeral? Because that's one of the few things we can do when they're going under DSHS Medicaid assistance. And I know we'll hear more about how that works and placement and all those types of things. But in that process, a social worker is going to give you a pile of paperwork to fill out and saying, and one of the things that's in there is a prepaid funeral plan that helps shelter the money until the time of need occurs. And so that's, again, where we might involve insurance. In some cases, it might have to be an annuity because of the physical health of the person or even the age of the person. But there is a solution for sheltering that money and bringing it, having it set aside to make sure things are covered when the time of need occurs. So any questions this morning? We'd like to get you on mic here just a second. Thank you.
What happens to like a homeless person that dies? He has no family, anything. What happens to his remains and stuff? What do they do in a case like that?
If they don't, I'm sorry, I'm hearing a reflection from the mains and I'm not hearing you clearly, but let me just say that I think you said is what happens to a person if they die in their home and they don't have any family?
Yeah, or like a homeless person on the streets and he like
homeless person. Well, yeah, typically the way you're talking about maybe an indigent, any type of person that doesn't have any type of connection to anyone in the area, hopefully somewhere along the line we'll find a connection. So as an example, we've actually served a few homeless people over the last few years. And in those scenarios, they have been able to find out that they had some next of kin. In fact, I'm working through an arrangement right now where the siblings are all out of state. And so here's the thing. This is why advanced planning is so important. Is that, yes, a person on the street, what happens with them, obviously the medical examiner is involved. They have an indigent program that can be utilized, but that's only after they've done all due diligence for them and for whatever funeral home has been selected to find next of kin to authorize whatever choices in burial or cremation. So the indigent program is cremation. So if no one over a certain amount of day, or literally days, weeks, there's no response, then the county will move forward with their indigent program, And for the funeral home, if they find someone, then they connect that family with the funeral home. Just like I'm saying, we're kind of walking through right now. What's interesting about that, in this scenario, the parents aren't living, there's no spouse, no adult children, no children at all, in fact. And so it would be all of the siblings that fall in line according to Washington state law that would need to authorize anything being done. Well, in this case, there's 6. There were 7 kids total in the family, and there's 6 kids that we need to contact. So that gives you an idea. That's typically what happens. We're seeking out all the next of kin and obviously asking them to pay for the arrangements. And that can be, there can be a lot of challenges when it's someone out of state, and we've had some interesting scenarios, to say the least. But the main thing is that we just want to simply care for people as best we possibly can. And so there's different ways that, another thing I'll even bring up kind of on the topic of caring for people is that any people that lose a baby in utero or under 2 years of age, we provide our services at no cost, with the exception of the actual taking the baby into our care. There's some different costs involved there, and the actual burial space. We have very limited costs, and we also have a discounted cremation fee from our cremation companies. Anyone else? Pastor Stu is like Phil Donahue today.
Just a quick question. If you've already, say, purchased a basic cremation plan, can you hear me?
You know what? You might
I can just come up there.
just speak. I can't hear. It's better.
If you've already purchased a cremation plan, but you didn't either a niche or hospice celebration, can you do those other 2 later?
Yes. The question is if you purchased a cremation plan that's all it includes, can you add a memorial service or even a place of burial later? And the answer is yes. The advanced planning can actually be changed, but you have to say it can be changed. And really, that's more about if someone was going to eliminate something rather than add something. And the reason is the state views is when a person sets aside funds for their funeral and it's not all utilized, they kind of view it as almost like you're taking advantage of getting that money back, especially if it's under a DSHS Medicaid Assistance Program. So the whole idea of DSHS Medicaid Assistance is you're setting aside money for the funeral that's going to be used for the funeral. And if it's not used for the funeral, you can retain up to $1,500, but you're really supposed to give any remaining beyond the $1,500 back to the state, as far as what I've understood. Anyone else? So you're all set, yes. Excellent. In fact, I'll use an example to answer that question. We had a couple in Cedar Park Church that bought 2 niches in our mausoleum, prepaid for their funerals and cremations, and they moved to Arizona. And their child was actually already living in Arizona. It wasn't for retirement, it was to be near one of their children. And they called me up one day. His name was Bob, that's simple enough. He said, Paul, we've moved to Arizona and we're not coming back. What do I do? I said, Bob, well, first of all, we guarantee that if anyone moves out of state for more than 3 months, that we will refund all but 20% of their purchase price of the crypt or niche, okay? As long as it isn't already used, like a portion of it, okay? Diana, you can't move out of state and get your money back. Okay, but there's the aspect of these plans are completely portable, and that's kind of why the government set it up, that you set it aside in insurance. Because what Bob did in Arizona is he called around different funeral homes. He said, I've got these prearrangements, and this is the price. And what was interesting is that the funeral home that said, we will fulfill that guarantee, their actual prices were about twice as much as ours. And so in other words, he benefited from having that already set up through us at a pretty decent price, I might add, and went to a funeral home that even though they were more expensive, they were local, they could take care of things, and they honored the price. Doesn't always happen. I might also say is that the price guarantee is in the funeral package. There are some things that are not guaranteed that can be added to the package or paid at the time of need. It's not included. It would be included. So the travel plan is for if you pass away outside like 70 miles of your permanent residence. If you made a permanent residence in Oregon, you would just need to look at, as an example, you would just need to look at the transport fees that would be involved with that distance, which is pretty simple to do. And typically what we would do is have a local mortuary service, and this happens all around the United States. We'd have a local mortuary service through the same company that provides the travel plans. We can call them day and night, 24/7, and they will arrange for someone to come out and take the deceased into the care of that mortuary service, awaiting us working out the transport back here if it's casket. You know, we would just transport the deceased back here and take care of everything in the burial here. In some cases, it might be that someone's relocated and they have, like I've even had situations where they didn't have to switch the funeral home necessarily. We handled everything through our travel company, and they actually found someone local that will take care of the cremation for us so that we didn't necessarily have to charge the family a lot extra. So our guarantee is within the state of Washington, barring distance, as far as transport, like if someone passed away in Spokane or Yakima or something like that, you know, those areas like Eastern Washington, then there would be some transport costs, but the base of the cost of the package they select would be guaranteed. Now, it goes outside of the state, we can't guarantee it, but we try to. You know, that's our goal, is to set that up so it's guaranteed. Good questions. Any more? Oh, right. To bury people on their property. So if you were to bury someone on your property, when you go to sell it, you have to disclose that in the escrow papers. If they've been buried in a container. If you remove that container, you don't have to disclose it. You take them with, you know, wherever you move. If they are, you know, basically, I think everyone understands the term of scattering. If they're scattered somewhere on the property and there's no, shall I say, collection of remains that are there, then you don't have to, I mean, basically that's not necessarily something that has to be reported when you sell the house. But just because they're not retainable is what I understand. I could be wrong about that. We might ask our attorney about that. But yeah, that's my understanding is. Does that answer the question? I'm not aware of other states that do allow that. Washington does allow someone to, you can have burial on personal property. You do have to get, if it's a full casket burial, you have to get a burial transfer permit and disclose that and get approval for that. But if it's cremated remains, people do that all the time, and it's not against the law. You just have to have the permission of the owner, which if you're the owner, then, you know, but again, the owner has to, whoever the owner is, has, if the, like in the example of cremation, if there's an urn or urn vault, you know, placed on the property somewhere, and it's not then retrieved and taken with when you move. You just have to disclose that in the documentation when you sell the home. Okay, any other questions? Good. Thank you very much.